Has there ever been a time in your life when you were so afraid of doing something that you didn't do it? You were so afraid that your heart was gripped with fear and you were paralyzed. And instead of moving, instead of doing what you thought and you believed you were supposed to do, your fear kept you from doing it. I'm sure we've all been there. I know that I have. There was a time in my college career when I was entrusted with a task that I believed I could do. When I started out, I thought it would be a slice of cake. I thought it would be so easy to accomplish that I really wouldn't have to put a whole lot of work into it. But as the deadline drew closer and closer, and as I realized that there was a little bit more work than I had originally believed that there was, I was gripped with fear. I believed that I wasn't good enough, that God hadn't actually called me to do this task that had been set before me. I didn't think that I measured up. And I was filled with fear. And I was so afraid that instead of buckling down and doing what I believed I should have done, I quit. I stopped in my tracks and was paralyzed. And I regretted it ever since. I wasn't able to accomplish the task that was set before me. See, there was a young man in the scriptures who was given a task. He was given a task by his mentor to go to a church that was dysfunctional. What else is new? It was difficult to go to this church and to wrangle everybody up and to assign leaders, the elders, the deacons. You may see where I'm going here. I'm talking about Paul sending Timothy to Ephesus. You see, when Timothy went, he was young. He was inexperienced. He may not have known exactly what he was doing, but Paul sent him anyways. And he sent him because although Timothy was afraid, Paul knew that Timothy had something that qualified him for the job. And that thing that Timothy had, that Paul had as well, was the Spirit of God. You see, in 2 Timothy, the second letter that Paul sent to his apprentice, he said in chapter 1, verse 7, "For we do not have a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline." You see, this spirit that Paul is talking about, it's not Timothy's spirit himself. It's not Timothy's essence, but it's the Spirit of God living in Timothy that gives him power, love, and self-discipline. Because the task set before Timothy was something that he would not have been able to accomplish by himself or on his own power. He could only have accomplished it through the Holy Spirit and through God's strength. Paul understood that Timothy would face opposition at the church in Ephesus. He understood that some of the people there, some of the elders and deacons in the community, because of their prestige and because of their place in the community, he knew that they may not take Timothy at his word. And there were going to be times in Timothy's ministry where he would be afraid. And he would be just so distraught with his fear that he would want to give up. And that he could potentially become paralyzed and not do what God had entrusted him to do. So Paul encourages Timothy in his second letter and says, "Timothy, we are not given a spirit of fear. We're given a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of telling the truth. Don't be afraid of standing up for Christ. Don't be afraid of doing what God has entrusted you to do, because if you don't, who will?" I believe God is saying the very same thing to us. Paul, through his letter to Timothy, God, through Paul, is saying to us, hey, don't be afraid. You don't need to be worried about what's going to happen at work tomorrow. You don't need to be afraid of the election that's coming up. You don't need to be afraid of what may happen tomorrow or the next day or the next 5 years. Because you were not given a spirit of fear. No, you were given a spirit of power, a spirit of love, and a spirit of self-discipline. So do not be afraid, church. Do not be afraid, children, sons and daughters of God who have the Holy Spirit within you. Do not be afraid. You were not given a spirit of fear. You see, that task I was talking about earlier, I was afraid. I was gripped by fear. But instead of allowing it to rule me, I allowed this verse to sink in. I allowed Paul's words to reside in my heart, and I realized that he's right. I wasn't given a spirit of fear. The Holy Spirit in me gives me a spirit of power, of love, and of self-discipline, and that is why that task I had that gave me fear was the Next Gen Preacher Search. And I was afraid. I was afraid of what might happen if I did it, and what might happen if I didn't. But instead of being afraid, I remembered Paul's words. I remembered God's words. For we were not given a spirit of fear, but a spirit of love, of power, and of self-discipline.